All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Jim Pingle, and welcome to our June 2017 Hangout. This month we'll be talking about advanced captive portal topics on pfSense 2.3 and 2.4. First up, about this Hangout, we will be talking about project news first, and we'll go over a brief captive portal review, pass-through credits, pass-through MAC auto entry, Pre-Auth Redirect, some advanced voucher topics, talk a little bit about how to use the free radius package because we're going to be talking a lot about things that require radius. And it's easy to demonstrate it there. We'll go over how to set up radius time limits and then radius data limits, radius primary and secondary authentication sources, radius MAC authentication, and reply attributes from radius. Okay, first up for project news. There is an OpenVPN update out for the 2.34 users. If you're on that, there's a special update procedure you need to follow to get it. It'll update OpenVPN to 2.3.17. There's a researcher went over OpenVPN with a fuzzer and found some potentially remotely exploitable bugs. So if you haven't updated that yet, you need to read that blog post. There's instructions on how to update it. If you're on 2.4 snapshots, if you update to a current snapshot, you'll be fine. If you're on 2.3.5 snapshots, same thing, update to a current snapshot, you're probably fine if you're on a recent one from the last week or so. We will have a 2.3.4 P1 release coming soon. We're kind of held up waiting on some fixes from FreeBSD there. The release for us is, security and errata fixes. There's a couple of cross-site scripting things that need fixed. The main thing we're waiting on is FreeBSD fixes for stack clash, and then OpenVPN, which you can update in the meantime if you need it. That 2.3.4 P1 release will be released as soon as we get the fixes from upstream from FreeBSD for stack clash and they get merged and tested and everything. If you haven't heard yet, we have our Netgate support is Netgate global support now. Was incident-based support. We've moved to a per device model instead. Our customers have been happier with that, where there's not a limit on the incidents per, just on a specific device, so you pay per device instead of by incidents. The support is now 24/7, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There's several SLA options. It could be as low as 2 hours or so in different contact methods and things. So just check out the post there. It's got all the info, and there's information about what comes in each tier. Also, if you haven't noticed, around the edge of our presentation here, we have their new logos. There was a brand refresh. We're doing new logos for both pfSense and Netgate, so they're more closely aligned. So there's a blog post about that as well, and eventually you'll start seeing those logos in more places. They're on the website now, and eventually you'll see them like in the pfSense logo or in the pfSense GUI and everywhere else. So be on the lookout for that. We had an article on pfSense in the FreeBSD journal. If you get the FreeBSD journal, you might want to check that out. We were at BSDCan earlier this month. There were some posts on Twitter. Go back and look at our Twitter feed, find out what we were doing there. We have our MinnoBoard Turbo Dual Ethernet models. They're out now. They're shipping now. We've got them up on Amazon. You can buy them straight from Amazon or from the Netgate store. You can use them for pfSense or pretty much any operating system. They're i386 boxes. They do require UEFI to boot. We don't sell them with pfSense preloaded, but you can drop it on there or just about anything else. They're really nice. And you can use them for even just general purpose computers, leave them on Windows. But they're really nice and small and compact. It's a nice little form factor with 2 Ethernet ports on it, 2 gigabit Ethernet ports. Also, there's a new book out. It wasn't written by us. It was written by a guy named Tony V. Robinson. It's called Building Virtual Machine Labs, a hands-on guide. And they have used pfSense throughout that book and showing how things work. So if you're interested in that, if you happen to be ordering hardware from us, we have a few copies of that book available to be added on when you're ordering hardware models, or it's on Amazon and elsewhere. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about a review of Captive Portal briefly. Captive Portal prevents user traffic from exiting the local network until the user authenticates from the portal page, which we went over all this last month, so this is just a real quick recap. And if you need more information on Captive Portal, you can go back and watch the previous month's Hangout first, and then work your way back to this one. The Captive Portal, it captures HTTP and HTTPS requests and redirects unauthenticated users to the portal login page. And these portal pages are often used to present users with like a terms of service, a user agreement, or even just a landing page just to say, welcome to our property, whatever. Operates primarily at layer 2. So, it's looking for a user's MAC address at layer 2. It also, makes sure the MAC address and IP address match depending on your settings. You can have different Captive Portal zones, and each zone is a different portal, and it can be attached to one or more interfaces. You can set a bypass list for devices or either by MAC or IP address or host name, where you can skip authentication for some things. You can use local authentication, radius, vouchers, or no authentication at all. Once a user logs in, their traffic flows just like based on your regular firewall rules, as if the portal wasn't there. So again, if you need more detail on the basics than that, jump back to last month, and that'll get you caught up. So first, let's look at pass-through credits, kind of continuing where we were last month. The first thing we want to look for here is just the pass-through credits per MAC address in the zone settings. And those pass-through credits, they let a user log in, quote unquote, through the portal a number of times without prompting for a password. So it happens, as soon as they request anything, it lets them through. And it just marks that they logged in that time, and then it would let them be online as long as the hard timeout or whatever kind of limit they hit that you've configured. So you really need to have a hard timeout set if you're using this. So if you have hard timeout set for an hour, and you set it to allow 3 pass-through credits, then they would be allowed 3 hours of access until they get cut off, and at that point they get redirected to a login prompt, and they could use an account to log in at that point. So it lets you do a little bit different scenario where you're letting them have completely unauthenticated access for a specific amount of time or a low amount of time, and then you're following that up with the ability for them to get more time. Now you might do that like with vouchers or something, or if you have a login system, like you could have it set up where users could only get, say, an hour's worth of access if they don't have an account with you, and then they have to set them up an account in some way after that. You can control the waiting period before that resets too. So like if you put it's specified in hours. So if you say 24-hour waiting period, then 24 hours from the first time they made a request, that those credits will reset. So it's like once every 24 hours that's going to reset if you put 24 in the box. So that has to be a non-zero number if you enable pass-through credits. So say, just for my example, if you want to let them through for 3 hours every day without authentication, you'd say 3 here and 24 in the waiting period, and I've got a hard timeout of 60 minutes, so that would let them on for 3 hours, then it would cut them off, and they get redirected to the portal, and then that counter would reset after 24 hours. Now there is also this reset waiting period box here that you can use to try to deter abuse. That will reset their 24-hour counter in this example every time they try to access anything after they've done it the first time. So if they keep trying and trying and trying, it's just going to keep pushing their reset period out longer and longer. Okay, another thing with pass-through MACs is there's an area much further down here for pass-through MAC auto entry. Now what this does is it will automatically add a pass-through MAC entry onto the MACs tab when somebody logs in. So it's kind of like a self-registration style setup where they may have an account with you. Maybe you're like a wireless ISP where you have an account database already set up somewhere, but you don't know what MAC address belongs to this particular user. So the first time this user goes online, they will get your login page, and they can log in with their username and password, and at that point it will take their MAC address and add it to the pass-through list, where they will never get another login prompt again, now that once they've authenticated their device. So it's a pretty convenient way to let people through like that, but it's only really useful for portals where the users do not change very often. And you cannot combine this with Radius MAC authentication, by the way, too. So you don't want to try and do both of those at the same time. So because these things are sort of, they're set up as a bypass once they log in, they're not going to get a logout prompt or a pop-up, anything like that. And they're just, once they log in, they're going to be allowed to pass through until their MAC entry is manually removed. So once they log in with these pass-through MAC auto entries, they'll have an entry over here on the MACs tab, and you'll have to delete it from there. Now there are scriptable ways to delete that, but you would have to set up a script to actually the script would actually have to log in and then read like a CSRF token and then submit the post with the correct ID to remove it, and then so on and so forth. So that's going to be a little tricky to do programmatically, but it can be done, at least until in the future when we get an API and that sort of thing may be a lot easier then. But at the moment, it's kind of tricky to do programmatically from a remote host. There's also an option to set that to where it will store their username along with the MAC address, so you can so you have a record of what user went along with that. Which is probably more convenient for most people. If you're having them log in with a username and password, you might want to make sure that that user and that MAC address are associated. Here's a kind of a little tricky one that can actually be pretty useful. The pre-auth redirect, which is here with the other redirect options, pre-auth redirect URL right there. Pre-auth redirect, it forces users to a page outside the firewall before the portal login screen. Now, it's outside the firewall. That doesn't necessarily mean it's remote to your network. It could be another web server locally to you, like on a DMZ, or it could be something remote, like a cloud or hosted site of some sort. How this works is, first the user attempts to load anything, at which point the user would get redirected to the portal page. But instead of showing the login page, the portal checks their request and says, that they're not trying to go to the right place. I'm going to send them over to this pre-auth URL instead. And so they get sent to the pre-auth URL and that page loads. Then on that page, you put a link back to your portal. And when they click that link, the portal page will get loaded because it sees the request coming just the right way. And at that point, the login page loads, then they can log in, and then they get sent back to the pre-auth URL. So you do need to make sure your outside page links back to the pre-auth URL. And if that site is remote, you need to add it to one of your bypass lists. Now, in my example, I've got them redirected to portal.example.com. And I know where that one is. It has one address, it never changes. So I just put it on my allowed IP addresses list here. Just allowed 198.5100.9 there. And it says host for pre-auth redirect. Now, you also do have to upload a different portal page that has code that will handle this pre-auth redirect. There's an example in the book, and I'm also going to post it along with this hangout. It just requires this extra block of PHP code here at the top of your page. The rest of this page is identical to the Captain Portal login page from last month. And we've got, just includes globals, and it takes the URL that the user requested and strips off, the actual Captain Portal parameters from it. So we're just looking at the redirect URL. And if the redirect URL isn't trying to send them to the pre-auth redirect page, then it will try to load the portal page. And then, at the end, it will try to redirect them back there. So basically, anytime somebody hits the portal, if they're not already trying to go to the pre-auth redirect URL page, it will try to force them there. And it will load that page, send them over there, and then the landing page, and I'll show you how this looks in a second, just has a link back to the portal. Now, I kind of cut out the host name here. This is going to have to be changed to be specific to your portal. But it would be, I've got HTTPS on for my portal, so this would be my host name here where the X's are, and then colon 8003. If you just have HTTP, it could be your IP address and then colon 8002, and then /index.php, and then the zone is my guest network, and then the redirect URL. Now this here is the important part. In this, it's a URL encoded, which you can find URL encoders all over the web, or they're built into a lot of text editors. But this parameter here has to exactly match what is in the pre-auth redirect URL box here. Like if you put a trailing slash here, it's got to have a trailing slash in the redirect URL. And that will, this is just, one's just the encoded form of the other. And like there's a, I can't remember where it is in Notepad++, but I think there's one in there. I usually use Ultra Edit, and then there's just a button you can click that will change it in HTML over to have that encoding, and it's super easy to do, or you can go online and find a URL encoder if you need to do that. So yeah, so it's just this little bit of PHP that reads that, and then in your landing page, you just have a link back to your portal. And let's see how that looks when it's running here. So I've just got my client behind the captive portal. I'm just going to try to go to Google. But instead of my login page, bam, I went to the pre-auth redirect page. Here I am. And I click the link to portal login. I got my portal login instead. Login, and that sends me back here. Now, normally you would have other links here or other information, and the login link would just be, off to the side, whatever. So you might have links to other information about your business or the specific location of your business or whatever, and from there they can go anywhere they need to go. So that's pretty straightforward once you know how it works. But we've had a lot of people try that and get confused and weren't able to quite make it work. But the whole flow of how you bounce back and forth between the pages can be a bit confusing, and people also didn't quite get that you have to have this extra block of code plus this linking back just right in order for it to work. So a few different moving parts there, but once you get it down, you might find a good use for that. And again, that's just the example we set up. Using that bit of PHP code as a base, if you know your way around there, you could set that up to redirect in a slightly different way if you want, or run a different check. It's entirely up to whatever your mind can imagine there. So you can take that and run with it. All right. So that's that. Talk a little bit about some more advanced voucher topics here. The voucher bits control how these vouchers are generated here. Even though right now our key size, I think it's 64-bit, it used to be 32, but our bits that we add up here only add up to 31, which was one less than 32, which was the typical key size. What this means is there are 16 roll bits, 10 ticket bits, and 5 checksum bits. The checksum bits are primarily just to make sure ensure validity and make sure something's not corrupted, whatnot. But the roll bits and ticket bits determine how many rolls and tickets you can have. So the default of 16 roll bits means you can have 2 to the 16th power minus 1 or 65,535 rolls, and you have 10 ticket bits, which is 2 to the 10th power minus 1 or 1,023 tickets per roll. So using that, you can kind of work the math out there. Even if you knock the roll bits down by 1 to 15, for example, you'd have 32,000 or 767 rolls. And by going up to 11 ticket bits, you could have 2 to the 11th power minus 1 or the 2047 tickets per roll. So you have some flexibility there. Just keep in mind it's binary math, so it's going to be halving and doubling, whatever you do. So when you adjust those, just make sure your total is 31 or less, and you'll be okay. We have had some customers say, we need more tickets per roll. I don't know if we ever had anybody say we need more rolls. We have 65,000 rolls, but yeah, if you could knock the roll bits down a couple, knock the ticket bits up, and you might be all right. So if you want more tickets in a roll, like I said, decrease the roll bits, increase the ticket bits. More rolls with less tickets, decrease ticket bits, increase roll bits. Now, Um, a more common question than that is, controlling the length of the voucher codes or complexity of the voucher codes. Uh, we do get a few people out there who want to make either voucher codes that are longer but simpler or just plain shorter. Um, Now, there are a couple different ways you can influence the length of the voucher. One way is by changing your character set. Another way is by changing the key size. So if you want the voucher codes to be simpler, you can just adjust your character set here. You can see by default we include most digits, but not all lowercase, almost all lowercase letters and almost all uppercase letters. We do avoid some ambiguous numbers and letters, things like O and 0 and L and 1. I think there's a 9 and G. I think some people can get confused, or a 9 and a lowercase q, maybe it was. But there's several, or maybe it's, no, I think it was G. But there's several different ones that can be confusing. But if you want to make it so that you have, like, say, just all uppercase letters, you could do that. Um, but as a consequence, the voucher code is going to get longer because it needs to be able to represent more, you know, uh, bits of entropy there. So, you reduce your character set, you're going to end up with longer vouchers. So to do the opposite of that, if you want to make a shorter voucher code, you could include more characters. You could put special characters in there, but those would be, again, a little bit more difficult for users to type, so maybe a shorter code may or may not be worth it in that case. Now, the other way to influence these is to change your key size. We don't have a way to do that in the GUI. We don't really encourage making a shorter key because it's less secure. But you can do it if you really need to have a shorter voucher code and you're not terribly worried about somebody being able to, figure out the pattern and generate their own, their own voucher code. So pretty easy to do if you're familiar with the shell. Technically, you could do it from diagnostics command, but it's better to do it from the shell. So if you do this, there's OpenSSL space gen RSA space 31. That's going to make a 31-bit key, and that's redirected to a private.key file in the temp directory. And then you can use the second OpenSSL command there, OpenSSL RSA -pubout -outform uppercase pem, and then it takes an input of the private key and outputs a public key. So those two files, the private key and the public key, you would download them off the firewall, open them up in a text editor, whatever, and then you'd copy those into these boxes here. Public key goes in the top box, private key goes in the bottom box. And once you do that, you will then have to reduce your bits here down to fit. So if you just go to 31 bits, for example, just to knock, like, say, a letter off your vouchers, you could take it down to 15 roll bits, or you could go down to 4 checksum bits. So it's all a trade-off. You just have to make sure those numbers add up to the correct sum to be less than your ticket size. Okay, moving on. I think everything from here on is gonna be talking about radius or related to radius. So what is radius? It's a system that provides authentication, authorization, and accounting, or you might hear it called AAA or AAA, depending on where you're seeing it listed there. So the free radius package on pfSense can fill that role for a lot of uses. There are more complicated setups that you might want an external radius server, something like maybe $radius or Radiator or even Active Directory. You can do radius with NPS. That could be, an existing account system you've already got, authentication structure you've already got. Could be an external provider that's doing something like payment cards or two-factor auth for you, things like that. Most all of that is going to all be done through Radius. Now, free Radius itself does have some good options. You can do things like OTP and things like that, but using that for Captive Portal may be a bit overkill. But you can still do a lot of things, and there are some features that we know work in the free Radius package. That we know work in the free radius package that may not work on other radius providers, or it may require additional plugins or code or things in other radius providers. So there is some advantage to using the free radius package if you can. So I'm going to be, because we're going to be demonstrating some Radius topics, I want to show you how to do them in Radius. So I'm going to show you a bit about the free Radius package here. Because it's going to be used in my examples. The same features may be available in other Radius servers, but again, it might require something special. It may work, may not. Your mileage may vary. It's entirely up to the other Radius servers. First up, you can install the free Radius 3 package from System and Package Manager. I've already got it installed on here, so I can't show you that particular installation process, but it's really just find it in the available packages list and click install. And you can see here I've got the free Radius 3 package. And you may as well, at this point, if you're going to install it, just jump right to free Radius 3. There's a free Radius 2 package out there as well, but that is about ready to go away. So if you see it out there, go for free Radius 3, or it may just say free Radius, and then you can tell down here that it's version 3. We are going to be shifting that around here in the very near future. The FreeBSD port for the old free Radius 2 instance is getting ready to be deleted, so we have free Radius 3 available now, and it's going to take over as soon as those other ports get changed. So just be on the lookout for that. You can go to, once you have it installed, it's under Services and Free Radius. The first place you want to visit here is the EAP tab, because you'll want to set up some certificates. Now, there is an automatic mode in the free Radius 3 package. There isn't in the 2 package. The 2 package, you have to select an existing certificate authority and server certificate. Now, you do, if you don't have one, you have to go make one. On the 3 package, you could leave it on auto if you want, but that's going to generate a new certificate every time free Radius restarts, which is okay, but it's not very efficient. It would be better for you to go just go in the certificate manager, make a self-signed certificate authority, and then go to the certificates tab and make a server certificate based on that. Same way you do it for OpenVPN or anything else. Nothing special about it. Just make a CA and server certificate and pick them here. I'm just using my Let's Encrypt one because it was there, and it works okay. Which you could do that as well. So once you've got that set, just go down here and hit save. Pretty much everything on this tab can be left at defaults, but you could beef that up if you're going to use EAP for other things. Next up, you want to go over here to the Interfaces tab. And depending on what features you want, you will always need authentication, but you might need accounting as well. So you want to add an interface for port 1812. I have it bound to all. When you do that, it's just bound to star 1812 authentication. You do another one for accounting. Oops, hold on. Yeah, be right back. I got this. Sorry about that. Okay, so you need one for authentication, you need one for accounting. If you're going to be doing accounting tasks like time and data limits, which we'll talk about here in a minute, then you absolutely need the accounting thing. But if you're not going to be doing things that are accounting related, you may be able to get away with just the authentication interface. But honestly, you may as well make them both. There's no reason to not make it. It's just like 3 clicks and you're done. So may as well do it. Now over here on the NAS and Clients tab, you need at least one entry for yourself, which I've got at the top. I've just got a bunch of entries on here because I use this particular VM for Radius for a bunch of different things around my lab. Now this entry is just an entry for the firewall itself. It has localhost for the client IP address, so 127.0.0.1. It's got client short name there is my firewall host name, which that can be anything you want, but I prefer to use firewall host names for that. You could use a fully qualified host name too, which might be helpful and more descriptive. And then you have your client shared secret. And that shared secret is just a password that you make up that is specific to this particular host. Any of these other items down here, you can just leave it defaults if you want. There's no particular, I mean, you can set some of them up, but not all of them are even supported by the GUI. So, I mean, like pfSense GUI or Captive Portal, so it really isn't relevant. Now, once you've got that set up, click Save, then jump over here to the Users tab. And over here on the Users tab, you can just add users. just do usernames and passwords, and then I'll talk more about how you set up the limits and things. I'll talk about that when I get to it in the different sections down below. But at the very minimum, you just need a username and a password, and that's it. Now, if you want to test this, you can also go to System User Manager on the Authentication Servers tab. Add yourself an entry that points back to the Radius server here. So I've just got, the name is Radoth. It doesn't really matter what it is. Type is Radius. My host name is, again, is localhost. My shared secret is the password that I put in the free Radius NAS entry. I've got it set to authentication. It could be authentication and accounting, either way. If you set up accounting, if you just set authentication, just do that. Authentication port 1812, accounting port 1813. Those are the defaults. And I've got a timeout of 5, which is fine. Once you have that authentication server set there, you can go over here to Diagnostics and Authentication, set it to authenticate against your Radius server, and then punch in a username and password, bam. There, it worked. And if it didn't work for some reason, maybe Radius wasn't running, maybe the username and password didn't match, whatever, you can go and check like your Radius, the system log, and you might get some information about Radius about what happened there. And there's other ways you can debug it. But we actually did a hangout on free Radius and LDAP, I think, quite a bit ago, which you might want to, if you need more help with that, you might want to jump back and take a look at that. All right, so let's look at the captive portal settings that are specific to Radius authentication. Back here, just on the configuration tab, scroll down here to the authentication section. When you turn on Radius authentication, you'll get all these other options that light up that you can use. So you set authentication method to Radius authentication, Radius protocol. You want to use the most secure one you can. If you're using the free Radius package, MS Chat v2 will work just fine. Depending on your free Radius server, you may have other restrictions if it's off the firewall. But generally speaking, MS Chat v2 is what you'd want because there is a challenge response thing there where there's some protection of the credentials, but whereas with PAP everything is in the clear. Although if you're debugging something off the firewall, PAP can be useful for a very limited time if you are just looking to debug things and want to see the password exchange. So right underneath there, you just have the primary Radius server. Now I've got this one pointing to another system here, but in this case, if you're pointing back to yourself, you just go to 127.0.0.1, port 1812 for the Radius server, and then I've got my shared secret there, which I just have set to the same as a host name. But that's your password that's on the NAS clients tab. So if you have a second Radius server that is using the same account backend as your primary, this would be the same kind of source of authentication, you can put that in the next box down. And then if the primary Radius server fails to authenticate in any way, it will move on and try the secondary. Now the secondary authentication source is something else entirely, and I'll talk about that coming up here in a few slides. All right, next up we have accounting, which if you enabled accounting in your free Radius server, you may as well enable it here. That is if you want to actually record the accounting entries. Now it will add accounting entries anytime a user logs in and logs out, and in that accounting data it will put things like how much data they transferred, how long their session was, and other data like that. So it's useful things to have, especially if you need to know your usage. Now reporting off of that, it all depends on your Radius server. The free Radius package doesn't have any kind of reporting that would process that, but it's not too hard if obviously not on pfSense, but on like other Radius packages, especially if they're backed by MySQL, it's pretty easy to whip up some simple code to run reports against it. Or if you use a package that actually has reporting built in, you may be able to get some good reporting and searching off of that as well. Things like looking about who was online when and how long they were online, you can get some historical data out of that rather than just looking at the login events or like a log with login events. And also if you want to do time and data limits again, you will have to enable that. Now the other options down here in the Radius options, those all depend on what features you want to have enabled. I'll go over those in a minute when I'm going over these other settings. So first, let's talk about radius time limits, which this would be like, say you want to set a user so that they can have a specific amount of time in a day, like say, or a day or a week or a month or forever. So say you want a user who's only allowed online, I'll just use my previous example, for 3 hours a day. If they're allowed online for 3 hours a day, you would set an amount of time in minutes, like for 3 hours, that'd be 180 minutes. And then the time period you would set to be daily. So first off, let's go over the settings you need on the captive portal, and then I'll go over and look at the user. So here on captive portal, you need to set re-authentication. And what that does is it will send a new authentication request every minute to the Radius server and say, is this okay? Can he still be online? Is this okay? Can this user still be online? Over and over again. And it will check every minute. And that is the mechanism that lets Radius eventually say, nope, they're not allowed online, at which point the portal will kick them off. So when you have that set, there will be the re-authentication that happens every minute. And just so you know too, the portal has to perform that re-authentication on its own. So the portal does store the user credentials when that happens. It's not, a huge deal, but depending on your security policies at your site, that may be a concern. So that's the only special setting you need that we didn't mention before here in Captive Portal. Now, if we go over to Free Radius, you do need to go here to the Settings tab, and you need to check this Disable Account Unique. And then we just need to set up our user entries for a specific amount of time and a time period. So let's use my user here. We'll scroll down here to the time configuration section. And we don't need to worry about these first 3 boxes. We're just interested in the last 2, amount of time and time period. So if I want 3 hours, I'll do 180 minutes with a daily time period. And then that time period is going to reset at the start of that time period. Dailies reset every day at midnight. Weekly resets at midnight on Sunday. Monthly resets the first day of every month. And there's also a forever choice that never resets until you manually delete the databases. The use case for that is a little bit more obscure, rare. I'm not sure I've ever seen anybody really want that. But if you're going through the trouble to set up somebody with a user account, usually it's not something you plan to leave on there forever. But daily, weekly, monthly, that kind of stuff is fairly common in the field. So once you have that set, once this user is online, it's going to do 180 minutes. And then at the end of that 180 minutes, the Radius server is going to say, nope, they've been online too long, don't let them on. And that's it for time limits. Now, for data limits, it's very similar. The settings for Captive Portal and in the Free Radius Settings tab, they're the same as the time limits. So you need to set the re-authenticate every minute. You need to disable that account unique. And then in your Free Radius users, now we are worried about the traffic and bandwidth section down here. So now the only 2 fields we're worried about here are the amount of download and upload traffic and the time period. Again, time periods work the same as time limits. Daily resets on a daily basis, weekly or on at midnight, weekly resets at midnight on Sunday, monthly resets at midnight the first day of the month. The amount of upload and download traffic, it actually will summarize, the amount of data they have uploaded and downloaded together. So it doesn't matter if you set this is like a total transfer limit. So if you set so they can only transfer 1024 megs, say a gig. If they upload a gig, it'll cut them off. They download a gig, it'll cut them off. If they upload half a gig and download half a gig, it will cut them off. So it's everything together. So you can set your limit there and then the time period, and that's it. Now, the thing you have to remember with this, it's only checking the re-authentication settings once per minute. So depending on your circuit speed, that they could transfer a lot of data inside of a minute. So if you're on a slow circuit, that's not a big deal. But if you're on a very fast circuit, you can't really effectively have a low limit because they could blow through that in a minute. Odds are if you have a fast connection like that, you're not too worried about what users are downloading. So it may not be a huge concern for you, but it's just something to keep in mind. You're not going to be able to set a limit of any effectively set much of a limit of less than what they could transfer in a minute. So just bear that in mind. All right, let's scroll back up here for a minute and talk about these primary and secondary sources of authentication here. So you have these two boxes here for a primary radius server and a secondary radius server, and that's like the main and the backup for the primary, and then the main and the backup for a secondary authentication source. So those are actually two completely separate authentication sources. They're not related, and they actually need two different login fields on the page too. So you'd have two different login boxes, maybe one right next to each other, one right above and below each other. Whichever way. The primary source would use auth user and auth underscore user rather, and auth underscore pass. That's just the regular username and password fields that are used by local authentication as well. So those are in the stock page. For the secondary source, you can just copy and paste that whole login block, and then change auth user to auth user 2 and auth pass to auth pass 2. Now, why you might want to do that? Well, you would have two completely different login systems involved here. So it could be two completely different isolated sources, like you could have primary is Active Directory, secondary is free radius for a different set of people. It could be an external card number and PIN provider. We've seen that happen with a customer where like they had local users, and then for everybody else they would sell a provider that sold them like cards that had a card number and a PIN, and it would be good for so much time, and that data would be handled by a radius provider. Who made the cards. So there are a number of different things you can do there. You could have like a library type system where you have one login for staff and a completely different login isolated system for guests. So there's any number of different reasons you might need that, but you wouldn't want to combine that in one particular login field in most cases. So that that they're handling this separately. So the reason that gets confused a lot is because we have, the primary and backup servers inside of each of those. And so some people get confused and think, well, I have a second radius server, it's a backup, I need to put that in the secondary authentication source. No, it's not. It's a completely different thing. You just put that in the second field inside the primary. Now, I don't really have a good demo for this, but for MAC authentication, it's a little bit different concept. So what happens here is the user tries to come online, and the portal will see that, and it will send the MAC address over to Radius client or the Radius server with a standard password to see if it's okay. So if that fails, then the user's given the normal portal login. So this sort of like our wireless ISP type deal before that I was mentioning before, where you have MAC addresses in a database or your user database, but you don't want to populate those MAC pass-throughs on pfSense. You need the accounting that goes with having them in Radius. So in free Radius, what you do for this, you would go to the Settings tab and disable plain MAC auth. This is not plain MAC authentication. This is actually a different thing. Plain MAC authentication is only for older equipment that can't send the right requests. It's for like older 802.1x stuff that only sends a calling station ID with a MAC. It doesn't actually log in. So you don't want to use that. So we turn that off. And then you add your user entries here on the users tab just as normal, just like we did with users, except the username is going to be a MAC address in dash separated notation, or dash separated notation, so IETF format. So there's just, your particular places, sometimes you'll see it separated with colons, sometimes you'll see it all run together, but no, this one needs it in dashes. And then you'll put in a password here, and the password for all of these MAC address users is going to be identical because there's a portal setting here that we'll use for that, and that's right here. There's a Radius MAC authentication, you enable it here, and then there's a MAC authentication secret, which is your password that's going to be used for all of these MAC users. Now, this should be something long and random, but it is only used between Captive Portal and these Radius users, nowhere else. A user will never type this in on their own. So just keep that in mind. Just make it something long, randomly generated, whatever. Now, once those entries are there, it's all just going to work. you might have to set your MAC format down here to IETF. FreeRadius is pretty forgiving with that, but you may as well set it that way because that's the format it wants, just to be on the safe side. Okay, that's it for MAC authentication. One last thing here for reply attributes. You can send back other custom information here with users in the reply attributes, and those are handled here at the bottom. These additional radius attributes reply items here. Now there's a standard radius syntax for these. I think I've got some on one of my users here. None of these are the example ones though, but there, like that. You can set them there, or a couple of these do actually have fields here in the GUI. Now there is per user session length here that requires you to also enable an option in Captive Portal. Where is that? Okay, under time configuration, there's session timeout, which you can have a custom per user session timeout here until they get kicked off. It's sort of like a hard timeout for this user. If you want to use that, you do need to come back over here to Captive Portal, and under the radius options, you'll want to set use radius session timeout attribute. So if you want to use that one, you have to set that. There's also a per user idle timeout value. We don't have a GUI entry for that, but you just set it, like idle dash timeout equals and then your number. Just the idle timeout is the parameter, and it's formatted just like I've shown you here in this. You do have per user data limits that you can set as well. And those set up automatic limiters for the user when they log in. This maximum bandwidth down and maximum bandwidth up. That's where you can set the bandwidth limits, and those are set in kilobits per second. So keep that in mind when you're trying to calculate it out. It's kilobits per second, not megabits, not bits, but kilobits. And if you have some other radius system, you can use these attributes here, either whisper bandwidth max up and whisper bandwidth max down. There's also chili spot bandwidth max up and chili spot bandwidth max down. Use either one set or the other, and set that up in your radius server. And you can also set a post user or per user redirection URL. So after they log in, you could send them somewhere else based on the radius reply. So, and that's in the whisper-redirection-URL reply attribute, and it just takes a full standard URL, http:// whatever. You can set that manually in a reply item. One thing I think I remembered, I forgot to mention back here when we were looking at accounting, the accounting updates. I don't think I mentioned that. If you are using an accounting feature, make sure this is set to stop start free radius. If you're using free radius, again, with other providers, your mileage may vary there, but you want to make sure you do that on. If you're looking to use the time and data limits on free radius package, do the stop start free radius. All right, that's it. That's all I had set to go. I don't know if anybody's got any questions, anything you might want to talk about. I do have just a couple of minutes for that. It was sort of like just a grab bag of advanced things in Captive Portal. I think it should pretty much cover anything that somebody might want to do with it now. Okay, well, if there aren't any questions, we'll just go ahead and call it a day then. Well, thank you for attending, and we'll be back next month. And just keep an eye on Twitter and other social media and everything. See what our hangout's going to be next month. All right, we'll see you then.